I've got the, I'm trying to work on just getting a clean copy of the table of contents of the Abhidharma Kosa. The Abhidharma Kosa is like 4,000 page books or 500 page books. And, but it's got a very detailed table of contents. So just reading through the table of contents tells you a lot about the kind of subjects that they were interested in talking about and what their approach was. And then, you can zero in on certain things. I mean, a lot of it has been sort of superseded by later, teachings on the same subject. But occasionally, when you go back to the beginning, you see things that people missed or haven't that are interesting. Well, tonight I thought we would continue. I was reading from the Glimpses of Abhidharma, Trungpa's book, Abhidharma, in which he doesn't talk too much about Abhidharma, but really a good book, and that a lot of his kind of basic approach comes out. And tonight, last time we did his introduction, where he did talk a bit about Abhidharma in a kind of psychological way. And tonight he's going to talk, and we're going to do the 5 skandhas. So the 5 skandhas are form, feeling, perception, concept, and consciousness. And tonight he's going to talk about form. And interestingly enough, he's not going to hardly mention form. Form in the early Abhidharma sense, as we talked about some classes previously, is essentially sense objects and your sense organs. So what the sights you perceive, the sounds that you hear, the things that you touch, the things that you smell, the things that you taste, and the objects that your mind creates from those sense perceptions. That's the world of form. And it kind of is partially inside and partially outside. There's the sense organs and the putting it all together, but then there's the sense objects, which in the early Buddhism are generally taken to be, real in the common sense way, that we're perceiving things that are actually out there, that there are these objects. Later on, in the more subtle Buddhist thought, like in Yogacara, and from then on, it's going to be seen more as that we're not, everything we experience within our own mind. So we really can't say too much about the outside, what its characteristics are, because we've actually never really experienced it. We've only experienced various kinds of mental states and so forth. In fact, we're going to talk about that tonight, because as he begins his discussion of the first skandha, the skandha of form, which is generally, as I said, the material world, form, obviously, he's going to actually end up just going in right into the Yogacara model. So, without any more introduction, to begin, he says, we could begin our discussion of form by discussing the origin of all psychological problems, the origin of neurotic mind. This is a tendency to identify oneself with desires and conflicts related to a world outside. And the question is immediately there as to whether such conflicts actually exist externally or whether they are internal. This uncertainty solidifies the whole sense that a problem of some kind exists. What is real? What is not real? That is always our biggest problem. It is ego's problem. The Abhidharma, its whole contents with all the details, is based on the point of view of egolessness. When we talk about egolessness, that does not mean simply the absence of ego itself. It means also the absence of the projections of ego. Egolessness comes more or less as a byproduct of seeing the transitory, transparent nature of the world outside. Once we have dealt with the projections of ego and seen their transitory and transparent nature, then ego has no reference point, nothing to relate to. So the notions of inside and outside are interdependent. Ego began, and its projections began. Ego managed to maintain its identity by means of its projections. When we are able to see the projections as non-substantial, ego becomes transparent correspondingly. According to the Abhidharma, ego consists of one of its aspects of 8 kinds of consciousness. Here he would be talking about the Yogacara Abhidharma. So there are 6 sense consciousness. Thinking mind is regarded as the 6th sense. Then there is the 7th consciousness, which has the nature of ignorance, cloudiness, confusion. This cloudy mind is an overall structure which runs right through the 6 sense consciousnesses. Each sense consciousness relates to this cloudy situation of not knowing exactly what you are doing. The 7th consciousness is an absence of precision. It is very blind. The 8th consciousness, what we call the storehouse consciousness, or the Alaya Vijnana, is what you would call the common ground or the unconscious ground of all this. It is the ground that makes it possible for all the other 7 to operate. This ground is different from the basic ground of which I have spoken before sometimes, which is the background of all of existence and contains samsara and nirvana both. The 8th consciousness is not as basic as that ground. It is a kind of secondary basic level where confusion has already begun, and that confusion provides an accommodation for the other 7 consciousnesses to operate. There is an evolutionary process which starts from this unconscious ground, the 8th consciousness. The cloudy consciousness arises from that, and then the 6 sense consciousnesses. Even the 6 senses evolve in a certain order according to the level of experiential intensity of each of them. The most intense level is attained with sight, which develops last. These 8 types of consciousness can be looked at as being on the level of the first of the 5 skandhas, form. They are the form of ego, the tangible aspect of it. They constitute the ultimate grounding element of ego, as far as ego's grounding goes, which is not very far. Still, from a relative point of view, they do comprise something fixed or definite. I think to place this in perspective, it would be good to discuss briefly the basic ground. Even though the Abhidharma teaching does not talk very much about it, the all-pervading basic ground, which we just contrasted to the 8th consciousness. The basic ground does not depend on relative situations at all. It is a natural being which just is. Energies appear out of this basic ground, and those energies are the source of the development of relative situation. Sparks of duality, intensity and sharpness, flashes of wisdom and knowledge, all sorts of things come out of the basic ground. But the basic ground is the source of confusion, and also the source of liberation. Both liberation and confusion are that energy which happens constantly, which sparks out and then goes back to its basic nature, like clouds emerging from and disappearing back into the sky. As for ego's type of ground, the eighth consciousness, that arises when the energy which flashes out of the basic ground brings about a sort of blinding effect, bewilderment. That bewilderment becomes the eighth consciousness, the basic ground for ego. Dr. Gunther calls it bewilderment errancy. It is error that comes out of being bewildered, a kind of panic. If the energy were to go along with its own process of speed, there would be no panic. It is like driving a car fast. If you go along with the speed, you're able to maneuver accordingly. But if you suddenly panic with a thought that you might have been going too fast without realizing it, you jam on the brakes and probably have an accident. Something suddenly freezes and brings the bewilderment of not knowing how to conduct the situation. Then actually, the situation takes you over. Rather than being completely one with the projection takes you over. Then the unexpected power of the projection comes back to you as your own doing, which creates extremely powerful and impressive bewilderment. That bewilderment acts as the basic ground, the secondary basic ground of the ego, away from the primordial basic ground. We'll go over this again later. So ego is the ultimate relative, the source of all relative concepts in the whole samsaric world. You cannot have criteria, notions, or comparison without ego. Things begin from ego's impression of relativity. Even nirvana begins that way. When ego began, nirvana, the other side of the same coin, began also. Without ego, there can be no such thing as nirvana or liberation, since you'd already have a free state without relativity. That would be the case. So as ego develops, freedom and imprisonment begin to exist, and that relative situation contains the basic quality of ignorance. The Abhidharma does not talk very much about ignorance in the fundamental sense of ignoring oneself. But understanding this adds a further dimension to the teaching of the eight consciousnesses. Once there is bewilderment, then a sort of double take begins to happen, of wanting to find out where you were, what you are, where you are at. But the nature of the bewilderment is that you do not want to go back and find out your original situation. You do not want to undo everything and go back. Since with the bewilderment you have created something to latch onto, you want to ignore the case history that led to that altogether. You want to make the best of the present moment and cling to it. That is ignoring. That is refusing to go back because it is too painful, too frightening. As they say, ignorance is bliss. Ignoring of ignoring is bliss, at least from ego's point of view. This understanding of ignorance comes from the Mahamudra teaching of the Vajrayana tradition. The difference between the Abhidharma and basic sutra teachings on ignorance and the more direct and daring Mahamudra teaching is that the Sutra and Abhidharma teaching relates to ignorance as a one-way process. Bewilderment and grasping in the sixth sense consciousness develop and ignorance takes over. But in the Vajrayana teaching, ignorance is seen not only from the angle of the development of ego, but also as containing the potential for wisdom. This is not mentioned at all in the lower teachings. But within the eighth consciousness, including the sixth sense consciousnesses, there is actually the possibility of ignorance turning into wisdom. This is a key point because wisdom cannot be born from theory. It must be born from your actual state of mind, which is the working basis for all spiritual practice. The wisdom of dealing with situations as they are, and that is what wisdom is, contains tremendous precision that could not come from anywhere else but the physical situations of sight, smell, feeling, touch, and sounds. The earthly situation of actual things as they are is the source of wisdom. You can become completely one with smell, with sight, with sound, and your knowledge about them ceases to exist. Your knowledge becomes wisdom. There is nothing to know about things as an external educational process. You become completely one with them. Complete absorption takes place with sound, smell, sights, and so on. This approach is at the core of the Mandala principle of the Vajrayana teaching. At the same time, the great importance given to the six sense consciousnesses in the Abhidharma has a similar concrete significance in its application to the practice of meditation and a person's way of relating to his experiences. Both levels of teaching put tremendous emphasis on direct relationship with the down-to-earth aspect of experience. So that was Trungpa Rinpoche's discussion of form, the first skandha. And as you can see, one thing leads to another. And he gets into actually a whole cosmic evolutionary theory, which he brings out in other places in his teaching and writing. But it's quite fascinating. It's based on this whole idea of form as ignorance, or ignorance leading to form. And in his case, form he's seeing it again psychologically as ego. It's in a sense that it's created form. It's made up form. It's this ego that has evolved, that's conditioning all of our experience. And so that's kind of the basic problem, the central cause of our neurotic mind is the idea that we have of ourself, and then the self trying to enhance, preserve, get attention for, acknowledge, and just generally sustain itself. And the way that ego sustains itself is by projecting an outer world. So the more serious we take things in the outer world, then the more serious we take ourselves. And we use the outer world as a way to kind of make us important, give us some sense of importance, that because of the important things that we're involved in and the important things that we think, we must be an important person, and so forth. So once we see that the world outside is just a projection of our own inner longings and attitudes, then, and we also, when we realize that the outside and inside is not really our two things, when the outside, that we're always just playing to an audience that consists of ourselves, because we're always in our own mind. Even our experience of others is an experience of others from our point of view. That there's no way that any kind of attention, or there's nothing for us to obtain from the outer world. That ego doesn't have any. There's nothing out there that can really keep ego going. So ego begins. That's the beginning of seeing that everything is empty. That there's this emptiness and transparency and flux and impermanent about all worldly experience. And it's so pronounced. The impermanence is, everything is continually in flux, continual sense of impermanence, and this transparency and emptiness, that there's no way the outside world can sustain a notion of ourselves. So as the outside world becomes less real, in the sense that we take it seriously and literally, our egos become less real as well. So that's his idea of form, and formlessness is related to ego and egolessness. When you're egoless, then you see the natural emptiness of things. When you see the natural emptiness of things, then that's a sign of egolessness. So then he goes on and gives a very nice description of the 8 states of consciousness. I particularly like his description of the 7th one, which is often hard to describe. It's just basically the sense of a cloud or a fog. But here he ties it into this kind of bewilderment that happens when we move from the ultimate ground of everything, the Dharmakaya reality, to a personal reality. Then we build a structure to that personal reality, but the whole structure that we're building is based on a kind of amnesia, that we forgot that we're actually connected with ultimate ground. We lose our connection with the ultimate ground, and then we're off into our own personal creation. And that process of personal creation then happens with this base of ego, these kind of formations that then produce a kind of confusion. And then as we encounter and experience the sense world through our sense perceptions, that's all clouded and conditioned by our basic kind of existential confusion in his group here. So it all begins with ego. Ego is form. And then toward the end, he has something where he talks about the Vajrayanas and how they understand this idea of ignorance slightly differently. In the earlier account of reality, in the skandhas, in the Abhidharma, and the Sutra, the Buddha's teachings, ignorance is just basically gumming up the works. It has no virtue. In Vajrayana, everything has a purpose and a virtue, and nothing is kind of thrown out completely. So Trungpa would all give these things like using our manure as fertilizer, and our neurosis is our internal manure, our own bullshit becomes a fertile ground for a creative awakening. That a lot of our energy is tied up in neurotic thoughts and behaviors, and so it's not a question of getting rid of that energy. We want the energy that's underlying our neurosis. That we don't want to get rid of that energy by just numbing ourselves down in some kind of way and using spiritual practices like meditation to do that. Rather, we want to free the energy that's trapped in neurotic thoughts and behavior and have that energy freely relate with the world as it is. And that kind of, as a whole, then sort of uplifts us into another dimension, if you will. So I'll stop here. Any questions you have or comments?
Could you say more about that, like the progression or the, I guess, de-evolution from the ultimate ground back to like the seventh. You said you were sort of touch on those again.
The evolution from the seventh. I'm sorry, I didn't catch the.
From like well, you mentioned you were going to sort of go over those again because he brought in sort of the relationship between the ultimate and then how it turns into the eighth and then the seventh. And you were going to maybe expand on that or re-say it.
Oh, well, yeah, it just got, when I was reading that, I realized that it wasn't making, it was piling the metaphor on very thickly here. So his idea is that the basic ground is a ground of all kinds of energies. And these are free energies, and these also, there's this idea of the big container. And in this container, there's all kinds of energies. And this is actually even a tantric idea called co-emergence, where each moment, energy is just kind of pouring out of the container, the reality, the ground. And we're part of that energy. That energy is flowing through us. It's our own life energy, and it's the life energy of everything. And that energy is always pouring out. And we can either ride that energy and kind of open with it and move with it, and that can become awakening and illumination. Or we can kind of try to manipulate that energy or twist that energy in certain ways. It's sort of like, so that's what we're always doing. That's our basic choice. We can either take energy in a neurotic way, or we can just let energy be as it is, real, and become one with it. And that's why later on he's talking this whole thing about his idea of how you deal with the first skandha, how you deal with the reality of form, which is the reality of the material world, the physical level of things, is just to become one with it. No theory, just become one with our senses. And that's the directness of what he calls the Mahamudra approach. But here, in his cosmic account of things, there's this basic ground that has all kinds of energies, and the energies are going out there, but we panic at being in a world that's that open and that dynamic, and we panic because there's too much energy, too much enlightened energy, and we close down. So we all of a sudden we realize that we're sort of out there with nothing underneath us, and we panic. And when we panic, then we create the personal ego, because we kind of go back into our sense of our shell. We go back into our sense of self. And then he's describing here that process. Something suddenly freezes and brings the bewilderment of not knowing how to handle the situation. Then he goes on, then all of a sudden the situation just has its own karmic momentum. He says the situation takes you over, rather than just being completely one with the world, as we suggested earlier. The projection now takes you over. There's the unexpected power of the projection comes back to you as your own doing, which creates extremely powerful and impressive bewilderment. So you feel like you're interacting with this world, and then it's doing things to you, and you're doing things back to it, and that just creates this whole, heavy-duty dualism of you and your world, and you're both in the struggle between the two of you. And that then becomes your egotistical ground, and out of that arises all kinds of confusion And that confusion then pervades all the senses so that the whole world that you're seeing is a confused world. You're not seeing the world as it actually is in its divine, dynamic, energetic, sacred way. You're seeing it as my neurotic world. So that's the sense of that passage there.
Do you think there's a reading of that that process that's, I mean, there must be different readings, but one just of moving from childhood to adolescence, or another reading being like, and we have these moments of freedom in our life and how we retract into, I mean, because it seems like such a cosmic thing, and I don't know, or are they all, is it a cosmic telling of the process?
Well, maybe cosmic isn't the right word. He's not really concerned with cosmology in the natural science physics sense. He's concerned here with, but he's concerned with the origin of these existential truths. Okay, remember we said before that these Abhidharma categories are various kinds of human truths or human existential facts. And one of the human existential facts is that we live in a material world. So how do we relate to this material world? And his interesting take, again, is a psychological one, that the material world is essentially a product of ego, that ego's created the idea of the material world as a projection by giving the world this kind of substance, the material substance, this kind of reality that it's. Then we give ourselves as creature a reality too, a substance, and both are kind of solid things, and that's what he's calling a basic situation of bewilderment, because we've made this all up. In reality, it's all just one flowing display of awareness and awareness in its display. And we're woven into all of it. So that's the confusion. So ego is a confusion. Ego begins the whole idea, and that's a fact that we have to live with. And that's kind of this idea of this, and it's because of our panic. And so I think in terms of phases of life, my sense of teenage years are just a total state of panic. I think mine were. In that, there's you get a certain kind of naturalness that carries you through most of childhood. But then, as you become a teenager, for various reasons, you all of a sudden become very self-conscious. And that's the time whenever you get this extreme kind of panic. And you feel, about who you are and what you are in the world. And all of a sudden that's very important that you know that, and yet you're quite clueless. And so there's just a space there before you and then you come out of that panic of adolescence, and you start then in your 20s and 30s and to kind of construct a world for yourself and a sort of sense of yourself in that world, which of course has got lots of holes because you can never quite get it to work because everything's because of impermanence essentially. But people do the best they can, and sometimes by the time they get to be 60, 70 years old, they have a pretty solid view of things, and that, and the funny thing is, it's not actually what's true. It's just like, all these old guys who vote for Trump. I mean, they're in they're in their various kinds of their world that they build up is just totally mythic. It has no, it's not the actual world, far from it, and it's not close to any kind of truth about social realities in today. But people do that, and it's a manner of protecting themselves from that panic that they, in some point in their life, was overwhelming.
So a lot of people are just living that panic for their whole life.
Well, they're trying to keep the shell. They've decided that panic is that whole space of uncertainty is an undesirable place, and they're not going to go there, and so they wall themselves off from that, and then they spend all their time trying to keep that wall up. And that's why people get very upset if you undermine some core belief that they have, whether it be a political belief or a religious belief or a belief about, all sorts of things, the sanctity of firearms, whatever. Then they get murderous because you just they feel like you just harmed them by opening them up to that panic, that outer world that they can't deal with because it's uncertain. And the reaction to basic space gets to be quite severe, and that's how Rinpoche is kind of framing it, is that everybody is kind of shown the totality. I mean, we're all shown the totality of everything, but nobody can bear that. And so we kind of have to close ourselves off somewhat, or too much. What we end up happening is we close ourselves off so much that we essentially numb and dumb ourselves down.
But the ground, this basic ground, is always not asserting itself, but it's unavoidable in a sense. Is that the sense that it's showing up for everyone?
Well, it's there. It's the primordial. It's what's always present. What's always present is a very vast space full of energies of different kinds. They're kind of in potency, or they're not. And these energies is this vast energetic space, radiant and luminous and so forth. And that's the basic building block of life. I mean, those energies, and then those take certain forms based on how we take that energy and project it in terms of the way we're conditioned and so forth. We see but the energy is what's keeping everything going.
You said earlier, I think it's related, that the world has no way. So the world's always in flux and impermanence, and we've built this ego, but the world cannot sustain our notion of ourselves. I think that's we say more about that. I don't know. I feel like that's something I need to.
We're the judge ultimately of everything related to our own experience. So we think that we're going to get some kind of assurance of ourselves from outside of ourselves. That, like if, again, if you go back to my metaphor of teenage panic, I mean, there's a point where you realize that, you're a teenager. Nobody loves me. Nobody cares about me. Nobody's thinking about me. I'm nobody. Which is actually a very apt perception. It's like a true moment there. And it's a bit, it's a bit unnerving. But, later on, we get the sense, well, if I do all these things in different ways in which I could become popular and become, make, that sort of thing. But even if you become very popular and you have all sorts of people who know who you are, that doesn't help with that feeling of inner emptiness, because they don't actually know who you are. They just think, they just know some projection of you. You've become material for their projection mill, but they don't know who you are. They haven't really touched you. So you realize that nobody out there can touch you. Nobody is ever going to know you. And you don't even know yourself. You think you knew who you are, but then that is kind of just like a juggling act, really. You're always keeping some things afloat, so it seems like you know who you are. But so there's a lot of that's why the outer world doesn't help a whole lot. Is because you've made up this whole world, so it doesn't tell you anything about who you really are.
But do we know each other to the extent that so I feel like that's a very Shunyata or Mahayana emptiness take, but what about the Buddha nature take? That don't we know each other when we know the ground? And we know our own Buddha nature? We can like connect and have real relationships on that basis?
Well, that's the more positive way of expressing it. Yes, is that what we really are? This nothingness that was the cause of our teenage panic is actually our Buddha nature. Another way to look at it is that's our freedom. That's our liberated nature. That's our awakened mind. The awakened mind is nothing because it's beyond definition. No one could ever know us because we're undefinable. We're unknowable. Everything is unknowable. They're unknowable. We're unknowable. Ultimately, everything is unknowable. The words and knowledge and concepts and our whole mental apparatus is understand even the simplest thing in its completeness. So, yeah, Buddha nature, everyone has Buddha nature. So in a sense, yeah, everyone knows us and we know everybody because we're all Buddhas. But so that would be the more positive way to discuss that experience, definitely.
So we can't know everything in totality with concepts, but can we know it experientially? Can we know? I guess it's just pushing it.
We can't know because in order to really know, you have to not know. You can't. You have to go beyond the theoretical, the conceptual. You have to become one. When you're one, then nobody's knowing anything. When you're one with water, you're water. When you're one with the wind, you're the wind. And nobody's knowing anything about anything. Knowing is always got to be a dualistic thing where you step back from being one with something, and now you're thinking about it. So there is no knowledge ultimately because you are whatever it is. You are the world. Totally. You don't know the world, you are the world. And knowing the world is always wrong. It might be close, it might be clever, it might be entertaining what you know about the world. In this world, but you've always, every representation is not the actual thing. The actual thing is the oneness, when you actually are the world.
Thank you. Well, another thing you said that was provocative earlier was the world outside is just a projection of our own longings and attitudes. And, it's pulled out of context from earlier, but.
Well, it's true. And everything when you step out of your house in the morning, what you see is a result of what you wanted to see. I mean, it's not, you had you were conditioned by certain things. For some reason, either you picked Kansas City or you were thrown into Kansas City or wherever and then, at some point you had a choice about where you could be, and so some people they walk out and they see a suburban world. Other people walk out and they see the countryside world. They see trees. Other people see the city streets, and then the people you see are going to be totally different. And then where you go and what you do is always different. So everything in your life, although in some ways it seems like other people are doing things too, you've chosen through a whole set of choices going back longer than you can ever remember at this point. That you've kind of constructed what you experience. Your experience. I mean, we don't wake up in the morning and find ourselves, at the bottom of a pile of straw or something random like that. We have very carefully constructed our world. Now, of course, we may feel, again, we have some kind of karmic condition. We can't have a world where we get to drive a Bentley around because we don't have enough money for a Bentley. So we have to have a world where we drive a Toyota around. But we've still created through our longings and our attitudes and our preferences and our predispositions everything that we're experiencing, even the people we're around.
Is there an alternative to that situation, or is there anything particularly wrong?
Well, what you want to do from the Buddhist perspective is, first of all, you want to see that process. That's always first. See how you're creating your world, okay? And then you can be more creative. You can see where you're creating suffering in your world. You can see where you're creating happiness in your world. You can create more happiness and less suffering. So you can improve your choices in a kind of altruistic, bodhisattvic way. So yeah, but getting clarity about this idea of that you have control over your world, that you're in fact creating it, in certain, allows you then to do some more fun, creative stuff with the world, and more helpful stuff. And of course, you start off by being more cheerful and feeling good about it because this is what I wanted. Here I've got it. I should enjoy it. So observing what we have, how we've gotten here, and appreciating it also, appreciating the texture, the essential quality of everything that we're experiencing. That's a starting point, and then we can get more creative, more artistic. Rinpoche would talk about things like the art of everyday life, where as we get more comfortable with the world as we've created it, we can do some more interesting things in that sphere.
Is that the kind of like foundational responsibility of Bodhisattva and Mahayana attitude? Just we take responsibility for the fact that we are making our own bed, basically?
Well, as we understand the world better, then we have the option to be and we also, by understanding the world better and appreciating it more, we have a natural sense of more enjoyment. And that joy becomes contagious. That's the best way to be a bodhisattva. The bodhisattva is not at all, it's not a dreary project. I think in some kinds of social work and in some kinds of Christian charity, there's too much sense of suffering and sacrifice. We should be, suffering to make the world a better place. Mm-hmm. Buddhism, at least in the tantric and the Tibetan teachings, that's not the attitude at all, really. It's that we have, through our own inner joy, we can transform things. Through our own happiness, we can share that, and through our own clarity, we can share our wisdom and our warmth and all kinds of qualities like that. There's no sacrifice is always just another ego prop. It's like taking the world too seriously and taking the sufferings of the world too seriously, and I'm feeling that I'm the person who's got to do something about these sufferings, and it's getting into that kind of romantic, heroic mode of thought, and that's all just a kind of fiction. Again, it's just a made-up world. So, all kinds of ways you can make up worlds, but realize what you're doing. It's not that you don't. Once you realize that everything's made up, that you stop making things up. I haven't stopped making things up. I make things up all the time, but at least I know I'm doing it, and I'm not fooled by my own fantasies most of the time. Are fooled by their fantasies continually and get huge media coverage for being confused all the time.
It was interesting, that line you said about sacrifice is just another ego prop. It made me think of those self-immolation protests and things like that. Is it sort of a negative way to help others?
No, it was perceived differently by many people. Other people thought that it was necessary, and but I think it's obviously comes from taking reality too seriously.
Or, I mean, could it be that in this case, the Chinese military took reality too seriously and imposed an unbearable situation on other people? I mean, if one person takes reality really seriously, that causes problems for others.
Well, certainly, yeah. Since we all have tendencies to, close down. If we're in a situation that's very dangerous, where everybody's closed, and there's a lot, violent things are happening, we're going to be wanting to close down too. There's obviously kinds of situations where you can't be very open. Now, you can always be open within yourself, but as far as expressing that openness, that's where you have to be disciplined. And if you're in occupied Tibet, or you're under occupied Nazi Germany, or or any kind of, you're in prison somewhere. I mean, there's all kinds of situations where you don't have any freedom at all, or very little, to express yourself. But that doesn't mean you can't be aware of everything. Nothing can stop you from being aware, except your own ignorance. But your ability to express your awareness will vary given circumstances. When Jesus expressed his awareness, he got put up on a cross. In India, they're not quite as violent as they were in Israel, so they let him teach for 60 or 80 years. But in a lot of parts of the world, when you open up and start saying how things are, that can be a very dangerous sort of thing to do.
Socrates.
Well, I thought this was an interesting. It was interesting on how wildly, this is again from the early. I think Trungpa wouldn't have done such a wild talk later on, but he starts with something very simple. This idea of the Abhidharma, the form is the first skandha, which is essentially the material, our body, our sense perception. But he's spinning it off into an account of how everything begins, with the basic energy and all of that. So he interjects a tremendous amount of very high-level Dzogchen and Mahamudra teachings into a very fundamental, simple subject. And that was what was good about the teachers. When they first came over to the West, they didn't realize how dumb we were. And quite often they would say some amazing stuff. Later on, they would kind of not be quite so forthright. But if you get a lot of the early stuff, is amazing for when later on, when more, you go back and you look at it and you go, my gosh, they were saying all this and it was just going right over our heads. But that's neat too. Okay, well, we'll quit for tonight. Dedicate merit here. By this merit, may all obtain our missions, may it defeat the enemy, wrongdoing, from the stormy waves, earthful days, sickness and death, from the oceans of sorrow, may I free all beings.
And free all beings.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you all. Ending.
See you, everybody.
Night.
Night.